Hello, this is Miss Blanchard's first at-home lecture series, wrapping up our second unit of the school year, Chapter 5, The Cultures of North America, in really the 18th century. At any time during this, you can stop it to take notes. You can rewind it to listen to something again. I wouldn't suggest this the first time through, but you can fast forward if you're going back to rewatch it before a test for review. We've looked at this map in class, but by the 18th century, all the colonies have grown. The French have expanded from just the St. Lawrence River all through the river valley, the Great Lakes region, and down the Mississippi into the port of New Orleans, wrapping around the continent in what's known as the French Crescent. The British colonies have expanded, not only just filled in these areas, moved down to the south into South Carolina and Georgia, but are pressing inwards. Things like Bacon's Rebellion helping to push towards the inward sections of the land. And even Florida has expanded here from the original colony here in St. Augustine, just this little tip here, to spreading out into what we would know today as the Florida Panhandle. Here's a map of the Spanish borderlands in 1770. The Spanish borderlands are having slow population growth, unlike that of the British colonies that we've been reading about in class that are doubling every 20 years. The Spanish never had secure political or military hold on the border. Remember, for instance, the Pueblo Revolt in 1692, and holds off a lot of Spanish control over. There's very little interest in this west coast, like what we would know today as California, until the Russians start coming over that Bering Sea, through Alaska, down through Canada, into the Pacific West. They're mainly fur traders, trappers, and hunters for the Russian fur industry. And so in 1679, the Spanish mission system in North America is going to be set up. And the mission system in California, there to convert Native Americans and forestall Russian kind of invasion, more or less. The French population grows by 500% ministers that are there to convert the Native Americans. So the French are still sending mainly the Jesuits and those fur traders and trappers, and even those habitants, the farmers that are there to set up farms and live there as permanent residents. And New Orleans gives France control of the Mississippi. They can access it here through the Great Lakes River Valley and down the Mississippi and out the port of New Orleans. Remember, off of New Orleans, down here off of our map, would be the French sugar plantation of Haiti. And New Orleans is going to be an important shipping port to export that sugar and other raw materials back to France. Here's the growth of the populations. We just said that French growth was 500%, but look how small it was. So 500% here is still not that large of a population. The Spanish, why do you think they have such a high number to begin with in 1700? Because they had been in North America the longest, so they had built up a larger population, and it is going to increase. But look at the British colonies. Even though numerically we're not as much, we are rapidly growing. Really kind of unprecedented growth here in North America for the British. If we look at what's causing that population increase, a lot of that is also going to come from immigration. The British colonies, unlike the Spanish and the French, the British are going to encourage immigration. Encourage immigration like in New England and in the middle colonies of dissident religious groups, and overall encourage it from other foreign nations. Like we saw Penn recruiting from Central Europe for the religious denominations, the Anabaptists, other Quakers, the Mennonites, and the Amish. So that by the time of 1790, after the American Revolution, when the first U.S. Census is taken, really less than half of the American colonial population is even of English origin. What's the largest percentage by 1790? The African population, of course, being the slave population. And then we see this other, but then we see German, the Scots-Irish, the Irish, and the Scots. And these are going to be our big immigrants during the 18th century. And then the Dutch here, which of course we also saw in 1700. Oh, there they are. There are the Dutch. And those are the vestiges of the Dutch Empire in New Amsterdam and New Netherlands. So this economic growth brings along with it increasing inequality. In the French and the Spanish colonies are economically stagnant compared to the booming British colonies that are growing about 6 to 8%, which is kind of unprecedentedly large growth. Over time in the British colonies, the gap between the rich and the poor is increasing, where especially like in New England, for instance, we had a lot of middle class. This is going to start becoming more and more stratified, especially in cities and commercial farming regions, where you start to have these rich elite merchant classes or large planter elite classes emerging. And in older regions, you have land shortages as the colonies start to run out of lands from their original land grants that create a population of the strolling poor, people who walk from village to village looking for aid and jobs. Few colonists live in the cities, only about 5% of the colonial population. Cities are geared towards intermediary trade, but they begin to attract more and more colonists seeking opportunities. So you see this population boom of 1,000% due to increased birth rates, falling death rates, and immigration, non-English immigration. Who are these immigrants? Well, in the 1790 census shows that half of the American colonists are English, and we saw that in that pie graph. African slaves are the largest group to immigrate, though they are not free immigrants. The Transportation Act of 1718 allowed English judges to send convicts to the colonies, and 50,000 are forced to immigrate to which colony? That's right, Georgia, that penal colony. And so if you look at this distribution, here you see European and African immigrants, most of the African immigrants being here in the tobacco region of Virginia. But we see other immigrants too. This purple group and light green group, purple being the Germans and the light green group being the Scotch Irish. And notice that they're pushed to the periphery through the Shenandoah Valley, sometimes we'll often call the Appalachian Valley, this ridge of mountains that run behind the original 13 colonies. Most of the immigrants are going to be Scotch Irish and German. Scotch Irish are the largest European group to immigrate. They're originally welcomed as a frontier barrier between the Indians and Pennsylvania. The Germans are the second largest European group. They're seen as hardworking, industrious, and farmers, and they cling to their more Germanic traditions rather than Anglicizing, becoming more English. And so they're going to, again, move to this backcountry area, this Appalachian mountain region here, past the original 13 colonies, kind of back where would be considered at the time period Indian country, where there's a lot of available farmland and it's cheap. So what are politics like in the colonies? Spain and France had managed to keep a tight control on the colonies, but England is a lot more decentralized. We've seen local representative governments popping up. In Virginia, for instance, the House of Burgesses we discussed, and in New England, the local town hall meetings existed. Most colonies, except for Connecticut and Rhode Island, have royal governors. Remember, Connecticut, founded by Hooker, and Rhode Island by Roger Williams, were kind of renegade, squatter colonies. And so this is that legacy of salutary neglect, where the crown, because they never cause a problem, never bother to create them as official royal colonies, and so they lack royal governors. All colonies had a colonial assembly that controlled the local finances, but they're nowhere near democratic. And I know the government pattern is one with a royal governor. Most of them are going to be incompetent and bound by instruction from England. The governor's councils, which are his immediate friends and cronies, they are to advise the royal governors, but really don't have much power. Most of the power is going to be held by the colonial assemblies. They're largely autonomous, very more representative of the colonists, and used to being able to dictate a lot of policy through money and their own legislation. The elected members of colonial assemblies feel it's their right to protect colonial liberties and serve their constituents. They are more popular than the royal governors, and they control everything in the colonies by controlling the money. This is what is often called either the power of the purse or the purse strings. I think your book calls it the purse strings. I've always really more outside of the book heard it called the power of the purse, but that purse being like money. So that's how they control things. If the royal governor needs to appoint a judge, it's the colonial assembly that raises and allocates that money to pay for that judge's salary. And if you don't have a salary for a judge, most likely nobody's going to take that position. Think about how this is leading into the American Revolution. Think about how, when perhaps some of these colonial assemblies lose power, how citizens in the colonies are going to react to that. Social class in America is much more egalitarian than Europe. In New Spain, it's based on that racial purity hierarchy we've talked about. The purebred Spanish, the Mezzitos, the mulattoes, and then the Creole at the very bottom. In New France, in New Spain, you had hereditary ranks from the Old World. And in the British colonies, though, the elite is open. And we've read examples of this in class, where you have social mobility. De Courvoisier, the new man that we read. A farmer can marry a French woman, have a child, they grow up and marry someone of Dutch descent. They work hard and they can rise through the social class, and that's social mobility. That when in a generation or two, you can go from being a lowly farmer to a rich established merchant or landowner. There's a large middle class, which is a pretty new phenomenon, though there'll still be a large lower class. But really, Europe is the aristocracy, the gentry, a few merchants in between, and then the poor that really serve the other classes. America is this new phenomenon with a large middle class. In New England, in the 17th century, we talked about Puritan congregations really governing the politics of local communities, that congregationalism of John Cotton. However, after 1690 and the Massachusetts Toleration Acts, that is put away with. So you see the rise of other denominations who are able to practice their faith openly by 1700. New England towns are growing rapidly. The expanding population is pressing against the available land, and by the mid-18th century, land is kind of drying up. They've reached the limit of their land supply. And the South then is going to be a triracial society. The whites, the Africans, and then the Indians. You have large plantation homes that dominate the upper and lower South, and small tobacco farms peppered in between. White males dominate Southern society. The Anglican Church is the established church, but has little power over the daily life of most people. And in the Upper South, you have well-developed neighborhoods that create some sense of community, but also white solidarity.